So let me get started with my talk. The title of it is Dreading Isolation More Than Error, and there's a lot more title underneath that I won't read to you. Give you just a brief roadmap of some of the things that I'm going to cover. Start by talking about why situational forces matter more than character, my thoughts on whistleblowing, zero tolerance policies, a bit on rationalizations, and then I'll close with a few suggestions for things that I think might work. But we have a whole panel doing that, so that'll be cool too. I want to start today by talking about why I believe situational forces matter more than individual character, how conformity with the groups we value is the most important situational force, and what that means for compliance and ethics programs. Then I may get around to talking about Caremark a bit. Decades of research show that people can be put in situations where they will compromise their professed ethical values. Many of you will have heard about some of that research, such as the Stanford prison experiment, where a group of college students were randomly assigned to be guards and prisoners in a mock prison and very quickly devolved into enthusiastic abusers or helpless victims. Or the helping experiment, where only 27% of people offered any assistance to a person in the very same room as them who appeared to be in great distress. When we hear about those experiences, we think, that's interesting how they behaved. You might even be impressed enough by what you heard to tell your friends about it. But you don't thinking about it honestly, I'd probably be one of those 3 out of 4 people that wouldn't offer any help. Understanding that most people will compromise their professed values has little impact on us because we know we're not most people. We're the ones who would not compromise our values. And maybe we are. Perhaps we've assembled today here in this room a group of lawyers, law students, and compliance professionals who would always recognize without fail when a decision has an ethical component, who would consult their impeccable values in weighing that decision, courageously resist social pressure and group pressure to compromise those values, and gladly accept that some might view our steadfast insistence on acting in accordance with our moral code as disloyal, or call us names like snitch or rat. I hope that's true. In fact, for today, let's stipulate that it is true, and that I'm not talking to you personally when I contend that the situation matters more than character. Daniel Kahneman famously questioned whether psychology could be taught, because while students will accept the general premise that actions are often governed by situational forces, they struggle to apply that to the particular individuals who seem like nice people. I don't think it matters. If you give any credit to my arguments about the power of the situation, you might work harder on fostering better situations, which will do a lot more good than asking you to spend your time soul-searching about whether you might ever compromise your values. To illustrate the power of the situation, let's start with a familiar dilemma. You've most likely heard of the trolley problem. A runaway trolley is barreling down the track and will, in the hypothetical, definitely kill the 5 people. I think it's a little backwards, but the track is going to go kill the 5 people. You happen to be standing next to a switch. If you flip the switch, it's going to go onto the track where 1 person will die. What do you do? The scenario is often thought to separate the deontologists who judge your action by the morality of the action itself and the consequentialists who look at outcomes. When you pose the trolley problem to most people, the majority take the consequentialist route and flip the switch. But let's look at a variation, the footbridge problem. Same basic scenario, the trolley is still barreling toward the 5 people in its way, except this time there is no switch. You're standing with another person on a footbridge above the track. If you push that person off the bridge and onto the track, you save the other 5 people and kill your fellow observer from the footbridge. Do you push? Most people do not. Rationally, it's the same problem. Emotionally, it seems a lot less heroic, to say the least, to physically push someone to their death than to flip a switch. Then let's take the emotional component and turn the dial way up. In the crying baby dilemma, It's wartime, and you and your baby are in a basement with 5 neighbors hiding from enemy soldiers. The baby starts to cry, and you cover her mouth to keep her quiet. If you remove your hand, the baby will cry loudly. You will all be killed. If you keep your hand in place, you smother the baby. Do you smother your baby to save yourself and your neighbors? For most people, the answer is, of course you don't. But notice that a pure cost-benefit analysis would say that you should. You all die if the baby cries, and only the baby dies if you smother it. And yet that fact changes no one's mind, and in my opinion, shouldn't. I'm not going to suggest how these dilemmas should be solved. People have been doing that for hundreds of years, and they keep arguing about it. What I'm suggesting is that when the situation changes, how we react emotionally to it changes with it. We may come to different decisions about the ethics of each example, but none of us would say that our fundamental values went through some sort of transformation in the last 3 minutes. As legal professionals, we want to be repelled by the irrational and think that we are not motivated by emotion, but by reason. After all, are we not here to learn to think like lawyers? I don't remember the law school class, maybe they teach it now, where we were taught to solve a problem by looking for the predominant emotion at work. But those supposedly irrational and emotional human impulses can also be heroic and what we recognize as the best examples of us. I have one more iteration of the trolley problem to try and demonstrate that. When I asked my son Sam how he thought about the first version of the problem, his first answer was that he would flip the switch. Being a lawyer, I of course changed the hypothetical on him and said, but what if your sister is the person standing on the siding? His immediate answer is, I throw myself in front of the trolley. He's a good brother. But he also revealed something about all of us. We often care more about the welfare of groups that matter to us, our family, our friends, our neighbors, even our country, more than we care about our individual welfare. Humanity never runs out of claims about what makes us unique, such as the incorrect claim that only humans make tools, that's since been disproven. And most of those claims do get disproved. The difference that remains and sets us apart is the astounding degree to which we cooperate on a grand scale. As a result, the group, not the individual, is often the most significant actor. Human beings are social animals. Most of us care about the groups we belong to and maintaining our position in those groups more than we care about ourselves as individuals. We also tend to make assumptions about people and their actions without considering the surrounding circumstances. I mentioned the Stanford prison experiment before, and it was run by psychology professor Philip Zimbardo. And he put it this way, he said, most of us have a tendency to both overestimate the importance of dispositional qualities and to underestimate the importance of situational qualities when trying to understand the causes of other people's behavior. We attribute mistakes and misjudgments to something about them and their character, even when we should know better. When he conducted the Stanford prison experiment, Zimbardo demonstrated the point himself. He and his colleagues had recruited 24 Stanford undergrads and randomly assigned them as guards and prisoners in a pretend prison in the basement of the psychology building. They wanted to test to what extent the assignment of students to one condition or the other would impact how they treated each other. The experiment got out of control fairly quickly, and on the second day, one of the student prisoners was discharged and sent home because he appeared to be having a severe emotional crisis. In other words, as predicted, the situation had a powerful effect on a student playing the role of a prisoner. Zimbardo was proving his theory, and yet he and his colleagues first questioned how they had failed in the selection process. They had let through an obviously damaged person when they thought they had, a bunch of normal kids, and they let this guy through. As Zimbardo put it, consider for a moment the meaning of that judgment. Here we were in the midst of a study designed to demonstrate the power of situational forces over dispositional tendencies, and yet we were making a dispositional attribution. Say that 5 times real fast. It's just too easy to assume that mistakes and poor judgment reveal character flaws instead of demonstrating the power of the situation. My personal favorite experiment is the one where seminary students were asked to deliver a lecture on the Good Samaritan on the other side of campus. Some were told to hurry, they were already late. Some were told they had plenty of time. All of them on the way encountered a man in a doorway, coughing and moaning, clearly in need of help. 63% of those under no time pressure stopped to offer help. Only 10% of those who had been told they were late and needed to hurry helped. The simple addition of time pressure had a massive impact on what looked at first like a question of values. Heuristics highlight where we use mental shortcuts instead of reasoning. They represent types of situational forces that exert more influence than would be expected as a result of a rational weighing of factors. A few of these heuristics are worth mentioning here because they often show up when we're trying to unpack what led to certain conduct, including the confidence heuristic, which explains why people who hold a dissenting view often do not speak up. If someone on the team takes a position confidently, especially if it's the leader doing so, others are less likely to share a contrary view. At the extremes, this heuristic morphs into the acceptance of authority or obedience heuristic, where we tend to comply with instructions from those in positions of authority. If any of you have ever heard of the Milgram experiment, where people will just keep pressing the button to shock the person that is getting answers wrong on the other side, you can see an example of the obedience heuristic at work. Then there's recency bias, where the thing that just happened seems like a bigger problem than anything else. The bystander effect, also known as diffusion of responsibility, explains some of what was going on in the helping experiment I mentioned before, where only 27% of people came to the aid of a person in distress. Being part of a passively observing group means that the individual assumes that others are available and could also help. So there's less pressure to initiate action than there is if you're in a one-on-one situation. Then there's the planning fallacy. Explains why groups often make prediction errors because they have the inside view that their competency will overcome all obstacles. This heuristic can cause teams to voluntarily sign up to reach unrealistic targets. Unrealistic targets in cultures where there's accountability for missing the targets has the real potential for danger. Experts like Richard Thaler, Cass Sunstein, and Daniel Kahneman also proposed a set of interventions designed to either promote better reasoning or to alter situations to promote better results. None of those interventions are aimed at reinforcing values. When we say to people, if you care about your family, you'll invest in a retirement plan, that pitch to the individual's values will have less success than changing the situation. Put automatic enrollment in place, and a lot more people will sign up for a retirement plan because they've just been signed up for it. They still have the free will or choice to back out, but that's a nudge that didn't have any impact on your values, but totally changed the situation. Thaler and Sunstein's nudges are trying to make small alterations to the situation to drive behavior, not change what we value. It's the same with Daniel Kahneman's last book, Noise, authored together with Sunstein and Olivier Saboni. They define noise as undesirable variability in judgments of the same problem. For example, we can all agree that admission decisions should not vary based on the weather. But a study published in the Journal of Behavioral Decision Making examined 682 actual admissions decisions and found that reviewers emphasized academic performance on cloudy days and non-academic performance on sunny days. Of course, there's no evidence that the integrity of admissions officers changes wildly with the weather, but the decisions they made were substantially impacted by it. I promise to talk about Caremark. Here goes. I will leave a deeper dive on the case and its progeny to the experts having that discussion this afternoon. But for my purposes, Caremark is important because it promoted the federal organizational sentencing guidelines as the guiding force in the creation and administration of corporate compliance plans. Many companies implemented programs that followed those guidelines, whether or not they were incorporated in Delaware. Caremark had paid $250 million in fines and reimbursements stemming from violations of the anti-referral payments law, and In re Caremark International was before the Delaware Chancery Court on an application to approve the settlement of a derivative suit against the members of the board. Chancellor Allen noted that federal organizational sentencing guidelines introduced a few years earlier offered powerful incentives for corporations. He went on to state, any rational person attempting in good faith to meet an organizational governance responsibility would be bound to take into account this development and the enhanced penalties and opportunities for reduced sanctions that it offers. Caremark thus swallowed whole the sentencing guidelines and effectively imported its standards to answer the question of how a company should design a compliance and ethics program. Those of us in corporate legal departments at the time showed the officers and directors that any rational person would have an effective compliance plan. Power of the situation again, because unsurprisingly, they confirmed that they thought they fit in the any rational person basket and instructed us to implement a compliance program as suggested by the Caremark Court. This scenario led to what Professor Todd Hod, who's joining us today, described as the criminalization of compliance. Being given the obligation to detect and prevent illegal and unethical behavior has given rise to increased surveillance in many cases. Professor Hod detailed the experience of Intel, where an aggressive program included surprise raids and investigations, not by the government, but by the company, and led many in the company to learn how to evade the compliance program, not act with increased fidelity to the program. Increased surveillance expects to surface more issues that need remediation, but it may just drive the conduct we want to change underground. A transparent corporate culture is less likely to thrive when the driving impulse of a compliance plan is a search and destroy mission looking for misconduct. Even worse, extreme levels of surveillance, ostensibly employed to protect trade secrets, can become a vessel for covering up misconduct, as was the case at Theranos. We'll talk a little bit more about Theranos in a bit. We've included the most recent version of the DOJ evaluation of corporate compliance programs in the relevant section of the sentencing guidelines in the materials. The core tenets of the sentencing guidelines themselves seem rather innocuous. For example, the guidelines require that companies exercise due diligence to prevent and detect criminal conduct and otherwise promote an organizational culture that encourages ethical conduct and a commitment to compliance with the law. But as applied by some, the upshot of compliance programs can be to protect the company at the expense of the wrongdoers it identifies through the program. NYU professor Allison Taylor put it this way: if the government agrees that a company has made its best effort to thwart wrongdoing, the bad apples it coughs up will face legal penalties and the corporation will not. When I read that, it reminded me of Professor Zimbardo's admonition that the bad apple dispositional view ignores the apple barrel and its potentially corrupting situational impact on those within it. With that in mind, let's turn to an examination of whistleblowing. You weren't expecting Socrates to appear first, but here he comes. He asserted that we're unable to find any time in our memory when we didn't know the difference between justice or injustice. And recent scholarship bears out that argument. Our very early understanding of justice also means that young children start calling out injustice at a very early age. As parents and teachers, we actually work to break that habit and get young children to stop reporting every injustice they encounter. We're going to play a short excerpt from a This American Life episode called No Fair. The excerpt is about a pre-K teacher who put a phone connected to nothing in her classroom to give the kids a place to report their near constant tattles on each other. Enterprising radio producers heard about it and put an answering machine on the other end of the line instead.
David, so what problem was this supposed to solve? The teachers were trying to get the kids to stop tattling. And why was that so important? Because it's a pre-K classroom and it's constant there? And so one of the teachers had this great idea. She took a tissue box, hung it on the wall, and then took this plastic phone receiver and hung it in it and said something like, "That's the tattle phone. Tell it to the phone."
Eli told me a lie. James wasn't sharing with me, and I don't like it, and I'm very upset. Mason farted in my face, and I said, "Yes, Mason."
So did it work for you? Like, did they stop coming to you with their complaints?
Yes, it did. It does work. Yes, that phone holds a lot of power.
This is Kathleen Jones, the lead teacher in the class. I wanted to see if the kids thought it worked, whether the tattle phone helped them deal with stuff. A bunch of kids told me they felt good after talking to the tattle phone. Though the why it made them feel better, it took all my interviewing skills. This is Gabriel. How did you like having the tattle phone in the classroom?
Good.
How did it feel after you said something to the tattle phone?
Good.
How come you felt good?
Because, well, I felt good because I told on the person.
Before we put the phone in the class, I had it set up in my house. Tell it to the tattle phone, I said. It's not working, he told me.
It did not do anything. It doesn't even work to me. It doesn't even do anything. It didn't stop Augie pinching me.
It didn't stop Augie pinching me. I know, Max. I know. Sometimes you want more than just to speak. You want actual justice.
The kids are adorable, but notice the reason that the teacher put the phone in is because they would spend all day arguing with each other about the rules, and they couldn't accomplish anything in the class without it. We have to be taught the importance of social cohesion, and that tattling on other members of our social group will disrupt our group being able to accomplish much. We learned the lesson well. In this excerpt from A Christmas Story, an elementary school teacher wants to know who put their fellow student up to sticking his tongue to the flagpole in winter.
Now, I know that some of you put Flick up to this, but he has refused to say who. But those who did it know their blame. And I'm sure that the guilt you feel is far worse than any punishment you might receive. Now, don't you feel terrible? Don't you feel remorse for what you have done? Well, that's all I'm going to say about poor Flick.
Adults love to say things like that, but kids know better. We knew darn well it was always better not to get caught.
We learned the lesson well, but when we become adults, we sometimes get a contrary message. If we become law students, the Honor Code demands that we report other students' code violations or be subject to discipline ourselves. Lawyers have Model Rule 8.3, where we are told that we are bound by the ethical rules to report certain misconduct, and we'll spend forever arguing about the exceptions. And if we work for a company of practically any size, we'll encounter language like this. All employees are obligated to report to the company any known or suspected inappropriate use of company assets, violations of law or this policy, or other similar improprieties, and are encouraged to report any concerns they have regarding any possible improper conduct. And if we're both an employee and a lawyer, then Rule 8.3 doesn't apply to us anymore as in-house counsel, because it's always overtaken by the command of Rule 1.6 to preserve client confidences. But because many non-lawyers and lawyers are now mixing in functions that don't mandate a law degree, those lines are going to become more blurry. I don't have a problem with in-house counsel not being mandated to report on their clients. In my experience, it's hard enough to get the business to freely share issues with corporate counsel without adding the specter of that lawyer blowing the whistle on the client. But note that it leaves in-house counsel with the practical choice to either grin and bear it or quit quietly, even if that means leaving their stock options and incentives on the table in some cases. You could also enter the Byzantine maze of Rule 1.13 and the chance that it might give an in-house lawyer to report misconduct externally. The model rules version of Rule 1.13 allows in-house counsel the opportunity in very limited circumstances to report externally despite confidentiality issues. They must first have raised the issue to the highest authority in the company, and then may disclose information only if and to the extent the lawyer reasonably believes necessary to prevent substantial injury to the organization. Ohio's version of Rule 1.13 essentially requires in-house counsel to escalate the issue, but the allowance of external disclosures stops short of allowing permissive disclosure and refers back to the general provisions of Rule 1.6 on permitted disclosures. The Kentucky version more closely tracks Model Rule 1.13. If you followed all that, you've definitely earned your hour of ethics credit you got for this hour. Fantastic. Having accomplished that mission, I'll go back to my thoughts on whistleblowing. For the privilege of becoming law students, lawyers, or employees, we have to unlearn what we've been taught about reporting on our colleagues. However, we also know that retaliation against whistleblowers is a real and pervasive problem. Experts distinguish between work-related retaliation that includes discharge, involuntary transfer, demotion, poor performance appraisals, deprivation of perks or overtime opportunities, while mere social retaliation includes harassment, name-calling, ostracism, blame, threats, or the silent treatment. One study found that 45% of employee whistleblowers say that they chose to remain anonymous to avoid the penalties associated with bringing bad news to light. When the whistleblower is named, 82% of them allege that they suffered retaliation. Many say they would never have reported it had they known what it would be like. Another problem is that we really don't know what causes people to blow the whistle. We only know what people say what would cause them to blow the whistle. Because we can't do social experiments where we put people in real situations and then see whether or not they blow the whistle and go, haha, just kidding, was that fun for you? So most of the available studies report on whistleblowing intention. If you saw X, would you report it? We've already talked about the idealized view we have of ourselves and how we think we would handle certain situations. Plus, when we know we're talking to an ethics researcher or a compliance officer, the bias toward the action we think we would take when we perceive injustice becomes much more pronounced. We figure out what the right answer is, and we choose accordingly. To be clear, I'm not anti-whistleblowing or whistleblowers. People should report misconduct when the situation allows them to do so without risking severe retaliation. But saying that is a long way from having rules that subject students, lawyers, and employees to potential discipline for failing to report misconduct. Rule 8.3, the portion of the honor codes that require reporting on others and corporate obligations to report should be jettisoned altogether, because no one should face negative consequences for doing what all humans have learned to do to preserve social cohesion. However, the sentencing guidelines create a paradox for legal and compliance professionals. The requirement to have and publicize a system, which may include mechanisms that allow for anonymity and confidentiality, whereby the organization's employees and agents can report and seek guidance regarding potential or actual criminal conduct without fear of retaliation, seems straightforward enough. The paradox comes in when we need to demonstrate that we have an effective ethics and compliance program. I think most of us would agree that it's healthier to have a culture where employees can raise questions openly without fear of retaliation instead of reporting to an anonymous hotline. But if people don't use the hotline, how will you have statistics to show prosecutors that people trust the program? I expect the experts on the next panel are going to have some thoughts on that question. But keeping in mind that DOJ guidelines instruct prosecutors to probe specifically whether a compliance program is a, quote, paper program or one implemented, resourced, reviewed, and revised as appropriate in an effective manner, and they also look at whether the company periodically tests the effectiveness of the hotline, legal and compliance professionals need to have data showing people use the hotline to demonstrate that they have a good program. So we spend a lot of time and effort urging people to use the hotline so we have a better story to tell the audit committee and perish the thought prosecutors. At least that's what I did. And I don't think it improved the value, the culture of the companies that I was working for. But it would have been difficult to decide to jettison the requirements of the guidelines, even if I was convinced that they weren't helping the company. On zero tolerance policies, which is the second panel, see, this is why I don't have to sit on any of the panels. I'm just going to talk on all of them all at once. And I could talk ad nauseum about zero tolerance, but I would run short on time. So I'll try to be brief in this section. I mentioned the other Professor Taylor a minute ago. In her recent book, Higher Ground, Allison Taylor examined common cliches, myths, and misunderstandings about responsible business. And she included the phrase, "We should have zero tolerance for unethical behavior," as one of those myths and misunderstandings. She wrote, "It sounds very brave, but it's a sign of helplessness. Somebody started this stupid phrase, and everyone else just copied it, like very often in business ethics. It'd make a great story if that were the case, but I think there are a lot of other sources. Zero tolerance has a long and storied history in America that dates back to the earliest settlers. In describing the state of Massachusetts society in the time leading up to the Salem witch trials, author Francis Hill observed that almost no offense against the Puritans' rigid code of belief was too trivial for punishment, and that the natural human desire to both cast blame and find explanations led to the ascribing of mishaps not to chance, but always to evil intention. More recent sources include the DOJ policies again, which include several statements about how companies should communicate intolerance for unethical conduct. The most pointed example is this. Prosecutors should also assess the extent to which the company's communications convey to its employees that unethical conduct will not be tolerated and will bring swift consequences, regardless of the position or title of the employee who engages in the conduct. We looked at the codes of business ethics for the 30 companies that make up the Dow Industrial Index. All of them express at least one thing for which they have zero tolerance. Some are exceptionally broad. JP Morgan has zero tolerance for unethical behavior, P&G for unethical dealings, and Visa's laundry list of zero tolerance policies includes inappropriate conduct and disrespectful behavior. If rigorously enforced, broad zero tolerance policies could promote a culture of fear if every transgression is going to be punished. But far more likely is that everyone knows that zero tolerance is a posture, not a commitment to action. To me, that seems worse. I mentioned Professor Ha. I see he's there. This is the part where I disagree with you, Todd. So the first part was great. Professor Ha is one of the leaders of the business ethics field and looks at decision-making, ethical decision-making through the lens of behavioral economics. Through the work of people like Professor Ha, many have started to discard traditional views of what causes unethical behavior, especially those that depended on rational actors weighing costs and benefits. Under transaction cost theory, an individual would most likely engage in some risk-reward calculation before making a choice to behave unethically. That is, what are the expected benefits of me taking this action that I understand to be unethical, versus what are the risks that my actions will be discovered and I will be held accountable? I don't know that I ever sat across the table from a soon-to-depart executive, and I unfortunately had way too much experience at that, who had completed that kind of weighing of upsides and downsides. Not only did they never ascribe any probability to the potential of getting caught, they never even considered any prospect of getting caught at all. Many or most of them never even considered the prospect that they were doing something wrong. If they'd gone through a decision-making process that included what happens if I get caught, many, if not all of them, would not have engaged in the unethical activity. As Professor Ha put it recently, unethical behavior is rarely the work of true villains, those intentionally trying to break the rules to do harm. Far more often, it's the work of people who genuinely believe they are good, principled, and honest, but nevertheless engage in unethical acts. Then why did they do it? Professor Hawes' answer is that rationalizations provided the needed motivation to avoid the ethical question altogether. Rationalizations are more attractive explanations for conduct than the actual motivation or plausible but untrue reasons for conduct, and they're around us all the time. Phrases like, everyone else does it, if I don't do it, somebody else will, and no one will ever know, are familiar to us. According to social psychologists, people use these rationalizations and others to justify why an action they propose to take does not raise ethical concerns. As Mazar, Amir, and Ariely wrote, for certain types of actions and magnitudes of dishonesty, people can categorize their actions into more compatible terms and find rationalizations for their actions. As a consequence, people can cheat while avoiding any negative self-signals that might affect their self-concept, and thus avoid negatively updating their self-concept altogether. Therefore, the theory goes, if you remove the rationalizations, the chances of unethical conduct are minimized. When I conducted compliance and ethics training programs all over the world, I was one of the many proponents of that argument. Here are 2 slides from that program. These are at least, I think this is the 2014 version, but I think these slides were at least 10 years old by that time. And the slippery slope of the rationalization starts you down the road to perdition every time. And then it gets worse if you take a risk, you get a successful result, it gets baked into your numbers, and you have to keep doing it. And then you have to start concealing it. I hated slippery slope arguments when I was in law school. I thought they were just a bunch of nonsense. But when you're an ethics and compliance evangelist, they're great. George is coming soon. I was one of the people promoting that theory, but let me give you an example of why I think it doesn't work as well as we thought it would. Consider the sales manager, we'll call him Joe, given a stretch goal that everyone knows is unreachable. Joe may think, the company obviously knows that I can't reach this target without cutting some corners, so they must be expecting me to be creative in that way. The company expects me to do it as a classic rationalization. If Joe recognizes that he's just employed a rationalization, he will not go through with taking those kind of risks. Because if Joe believes that he always acts with integrity, he would risk damaging his self-image if he used the rationalization to act unethically. In other words, if the rationalization is the crucial starting point without which there is no unethical conduct, the chances of unethical conduct are greatly reduced if they're spotted and called out. But what if you don't need any rationalizations to engage in unethical behavior, and the rationalizations only show up later when we are asked to explain our conduct? How would situations occur where someone doesn't need the crutch of a rationalization to make an unethical decision? I see a few possibilities. The first is what Daniel Kahneman called substitution. Are you faced with a complex problem? One that would require you to answer a difficult question? With substitution, you can deal with that by answering an easier question. Our sales manager, considering a risky way to make the stretch target they have been given, does not ask, does the company expect me to cut corners to achieve the target? Instead, they choose an easier question like, will this transaction be profitable for the company and help me achieve my target? Note that either a yes or no answer to that question doesn't impact the self-image of the sales manager. In answering the substituted question, a yes answer means that the decision aligns with and advances the goals of both the company and the sales manager. The ethical question is never even raised. You might ask, doesn't substituting an easier question carry with it some underlying rationalization? Perhaps it does, but if we're doing it consciously, we usually don't. Some people, some of the time, may actually reason their way to moral conclusions, but there's little evidence that that's the norm. Why is that? Philosopher Agnes Callard suggests that we do not ask ourselves questions that go to our belief that we are honest people who act with integrity because we're already using the answer. We know the difference between right and wrong. As she put it, no one would bear to see themselves as one of those people of weak character, which gives us such a blind spot about ourselves that we detect others' rationalizations, but not our own. It's not just that it's difficult to examine whether or not you're acting ethically. We find it unnecessary to ask those questions because we know the answer. The second possibility is that instead of substituting an easier question for a hard question, we don't ask any question at all. As experimental psychologist, neuroscientist, and philosopher, busy guy, Joshua Green put it, there is a substantial and growing body of evidence suggesting that much of what we do unconsciously, and for reasons that are inaccessible to us. People make choices for reasons unknown to them, and they make up reasonable sounding justifications for their choices, all the while remaining unaware of their actual motives and subsequent rationalizations. So instead of Joe the sales manager utilizing a rationalization to preserve his self-image while making an unethical choice, or substituting an easier question that does not require a rationalization, perhaps he emotionally reacted, "Do it," when presented with the opportunity to make a sale. When we question Joe later about that choice, we may hear about the unreasonable sales target. We may hear about pressure from management to produce results, or even better, we could get George Costanza's answer.
Was that wrong? Should I not have done that? I tell you, I gotta plead ignorance on this thing, because if anyone had said anything to me at all when I first started here that sort of thing was frowned upon, you know, because I've worked in a lot of offices, and I tell you, people do that all the time.
You're fired.
One last point on rationalization and their causal relation or lack thereof to unethical conduct. If rationalizations grease the wheels of unethical conduct, the theory is that it's because we want to avoid damaging our self-image when weighing a proposed action. But what if our self-image is not a purely internal process, but largely a reflection of how other people treat us? Professor Collard proposed thinking about that question this way. Suppose you're the main character of Gulliver's Travels, but instead of visiting giants and Lilliputians, the first place you go to is inhabited by people who revere you, and they think you're the most charming and insightful person around. Later, you arrive at the land of magnetically charismatic geniuses. By comparison to you, you're just a complete dolt, and they let you know it. It's highly unlikely that your self-image would remain stable through the course of that adventure. As a result, whether you're rationalizing or substituting an easier question, your thoughts are going to go in the direction of maintaining your status as a member of the group you care about. The question in the driver's seat for our sales manager is probably a variation of, do I want to keep working here, or am I a team player, regardless of whether that question is the result of rationalizations. I presented a version of this talk to the faculty last summer. One of the helpful comments I got was that instead of just tearing things down and exposing flaws I see in the system, I might want to mention some things that might make it better. So here goes. First, we should listen to and support the experts who are doing the jobs we hired them to do. When I was running a food distribution company in South Africa, our food safety expert was very smart and also very young. If I wanted to, it would have been very easy for me to undermine her when the team wanted to take shortcuts on processes that we had put in place to ensure food safety. It was hugely important that I publicly and privately supported the food safety expert. Any suggestion from me to one of the other team members, either in a team meeting or alone, because it would have spread like wildfire if I'd said it, that we were deprioritizing food safety to make sales, would have possibly had disastrous results for the company and our customers. I thought about that when reading about Theranos, the blood testing company with a product that never worked. In addition to the many other ethical failures exhibited by Elizabeth Holmes and her team, I noticed another pattern. Every time an internal expert raised concerns about the product, unrealistic projections, or anything else, they were gone. The CEO and CEO, and sometimes even the board, closed ranks and got rid of the expert quickly. Over the years, Theranos exited scientists, a CFO, a GC, head of sales, and many others. When business partners brought their experts in to evaluate the product, Theranos convinced those partners to sideline their own experts. When a journalist contacted the vice chairman of laboratory medicine at UC San Francisco to get his views on what Theranos claimed the product could do, he replied, "I'd be less surprised if they told us they were time travelers who came back from the 27th century than if they told us they had cracked that nut." When the experts are actually consulted, obvious answers can't be avoided. Second, you should not just tolerate dissent. You should curate and celebrate dissent. Cass Sunstein wrote, "In a deliberating group, those with a minority position often silence themselves or otherwise have disproportionately little weight. Anyone who's led a team or even run a meeting knows the frustration of having people wait for the leader to opine and then safely fall in line behind them. The leader's not always right, and teams are often deprived of the benefit of dissenting views that could have helped them avoid error." Daniel Kahneman, as usual, proposed a solution to the dilemma. A simple rule can help. Before the issue is discussed, all members of the group should be asked to write a very brief summary of their position. This procedure makes good use of the value of diversity of knowledge and opinion in the group. The standard practice of open discussion gives too much weight to the opinion of those who speak early and assertively, causing others to line up behind them. As leaders, we need to make sure that we do not make it more important to be on the team than to be right. To quote Cass Sunstein one last time, "Much of the time it is in the interest of the individual to follow the crowd, but in the social interest for individuals to say and do what they think best. Well-functioning institutions take steps to discourage conformity and to promote dissent, partly to protect the rights of dissenters, but mostly to protect interests of their own." I think that's the most important point, is yes, it's important to protect dissenters because it's important to protect dissenters, but you'll have a better business if you do. Finally, I suggest that you commit to thinking, not as a solitary activity, but as a collaborative activity. Treat the people you encounter as equals and be as open to being persuaded as you are committed to trying to influence others. If there's one message you can take away from the Socratic dialogues, it's not question everything, but rather persuade or be persuaded. To conclude, whether we make ethical choices will depend on the situation. You may ask, are they really values if we only employ them in the right situations? Don't we have to determine whether or not our values are really ours by testing them in a cauldron of ethical dilemmas? Isn't it only when we're forced to make hard choices that we demonstrate the values we hold most deeply? My answer to all of those questions is no. To prove that honesty, trustworthiness, integrity, transparency, courage, and passion really do matter to us, we do not need to test ourselves in the worst situations. If you want to prove that you care about those values, we need to work to nurture circumstances where those values will be allowed to flourish. Because in everyday life, we sometimes fall short of those ideals, and in the worst situations, we fall woefully short. That truth does not make us hypocrites, it makes us humans. And in human enterprises, situations rule and groups decide. Thanks for listening.